I'm Reba Merrill. Today is May 6, 2001. I'm sitting here with Henry. Warren, can I do that slate again, please? I'm Reba Merrill. Today is May 6, 2001. I'm with Warren Cowan, and this interview in Encino, California, and the interview is being done for the Archives of American Television.
You guys hold on a second.
Well said.
What was your name at birth, and did you have any nicknames?
No, I had no nicknames. My name was and is Warren Cowan.
And where were you born?
In New York City, in Manhattan.
And did the Depression affect your family?
It probably did, although my late brother and I, really had no way of knowing it. Our parents treated us as very special youngsters. And my father did go through the stock market crash, but it didn't affect us to any great degree.
What was your mother's name and what was your father's name?
My mother was named Grace Andrassy. My father was named Ruby Cowan. They were childhood sweethearts. They knew each other. I think they met when they were in the 6th grade. And they married and were married for almost 50 years.
Did your mother work?
No, not really. My mother occasionally taught piano, and my father was in the music business.
Well, you talked about a brother. Did you have any other siblings?
No, just one brother.
Now, what were your hobbies growing up?
Well, I was a typical young boy who played baseball and football and hockey. And I loved baseball and went to baseball games in New York all the time. My great growing up idol was Lou Gehrig, whom I had occasion to meet once.
Were you fascinated at an early age by radio?
No, by radio, yes, because as I was growing up, my father became an executive with NBC. So we used to listen to particularly the NBC station all the time in my house.
Were you the least bit interested in film?
I beg your pardon?
Were you the least bit interested in film?
No, not really, except like everyone else, I love to go to the movies. And I had a special advantage. At one point, my father produced the shows at the New York Paramount Theater. Therefore, we had passes for all the New York theaters, not only the Paramount, but the Roxy and the Capitol and all of the theaters.
Now, this is going to be a hard question, but were you aware of publicity at that time when you were so young?
No.
Okay. What high school did you attend?
I went to an interesting high school in New York called Townsend Harris High School. And one of my high school mates and chums was Army Archard, who we have known each other since we were 12 years old. And if I may explain quickly about Townsend Harris, it was a special school that one took tests to get into. And they only selected, I believe, 200 new students a year in the city of New York. By some fluke, I passed the test and went into Townsend Harris. And the interesting thing is, I think, that I graduated just after I turned 15 years old from high school, and I was the grand old man of the class. I was invited to the bar mitzvah of one of the graduating men after graduation. Give you an idea.
Where did you go to college?
I went to UCLA. I originally came to California intending to go to USC, but met some people who talked me into switching, and I never regretted it.
Talk about your job with Alan Gordon. That kind of probably was going to change your life, but you didn't know it.
It did. Well, what changed my life, frankly, was that while at UCLA, I worked on the Daily Bruin, which is the daily paper still published at UCLA. And I was the music and film critic. Really, I wrote a record column. And at that time, I had occasion to meet this wonderful man named Alan Gordon. Alan was a young publicist in Hollywood who I met on a tennis court, and we struck up a friendship, and I finally went to see him and offered him a deal long before the phrase became popular. I offered him a deal he could not turn down. I said that I would come to work at his office every day from noon on, because I had morning classes at UCLA, and that he wouldn't have to pay me. And he asked me, what would I do? And I said I wasn't sure, but I would answer the phones, I would paste scrapbooks, I would run errands, and as a consequence, he took me up on my offer, and after 1 month, he put me on salary. And that was kind of the start of it all. And I might add that Alan Gordon died at the age of 50. Believe it or not, he died in the swimming pool at the Golden Door Resort, which would have Men's Week every year. And he was there for Men's Week, had a heart attack and died. And he was just a beautiful, beautiful man.
What was your first job after graduation with Alan Gordon?
Right after graduation, I went to work with Alan Gordon for a few months and then went into the Air Force. And I was there for about 3 years, during which time I would write copy on some of Alan's clients. And then I met somebody else who gave me a job writing copy while I was in the service, and that was Henry Rogers.
When was the first time you saw television?
When was the first time what?
You saw television. What year?
I imagine it was when Milton Berle first exploded on the television scene. And I remember also all of us being glued to television at the time of the Kathy Fiscus disaster. I believe that the Kathy Fiscus, that's the little girl who was caught, who fell into a well, and they were drilling for 3 days the side of a mountain. And I believe that was the first event that created national television in America.
What was your impression of television when you first saw it?
I just thought it was absolutely the coming thing, and we're going to change all of our lives. And indeed it has.
Oh, I guess you thought it was going to last, didn't you?
Yes. Well, when you stop and think about changing lives, it has been said that Ted Turner and his CNN possibly changed the whole relationship between our country and the Soviet Union. And people seeing CNN around the world saw a different side of the United States and of daily living.
In 1945, you joined the publicity firm of Henry Rogers, which you alluded to earlier because you were working for him. Mm-hmm. How did the job come about, and what did you do there?
Well, I said to you I was in the service writing column items and stories. There was a columnist on the Hollywood Reporter who took a liking to me in those days, named Edith Gwynn. Edith Gwynn had a column similar to the one Army Orchard writes today in Daily Variety. And she had heard that Henry was looking for someone, sent me to see him. He interviewed me and gave me a job as soon as I got out of the service.
And
at $50 a week, I might add.
How closely did you work with Henry, or was he the boss and you were just starting?
He was the boss, but there were only 3 of us in the office. And we started to build and develop the company. And we came to be the biggest publicity firm in Hollywood, representing every star practically in the business, including Doris Day and Greer Garson and Frank Sinatra, later Frank Sinatra, Kirk Douglas in those days, who's still a client of mine. Yeah.
Well, you opened the door, so how did you get clients in those days?
How did I get what?
Clients in those days.
Mainly by referrals and going after them. When I mention about television, I'll explain to you how we actively pursued clients. But there were friends of mainly Henry Rogers, acquaintances, I might say, who referred clients to us. So we handled John Wayne and many others that were referred by the business manager of John Wayne and some of his other clients. And we handled many clients that were sent to us from agents at MCA, but mainly through referrals we got new clients.
You talked about Kirk Douglas. You've known him a long time. You're still working with him. What was he like? Describe him personally, and what was he doing professionally in the early days with you?
Well, this was before Champion. He'd done a couple of movies, one with Barbara Stanwyck, his first film, I forget the name of it. And Kirk was a dynamic and original and way ahead of his time person who is still that way. He is still one of the most interesting people I've ever known. He thinks, and one year we worked hard to have him named the most popular actor of the year by the Hollywood Women's Press Club. And when they named that, they also gave out the sour apple for the least popular. So the year he won the most popular, he and I put our heads together and decided that next year we'd like to have him named the least popular. And that was the way Kirk thought. He was interesting and colorful and taught me that it isn't important whether people like you or dislike you. You just don't want them to ignore you.
Early in your career, you worked on the first Oscar campaign. It just blew me away. Describe how it came about.
When I started working with Henry Rogers, he had signed Joan Crawford as a client. And Joan Crawford, after many, many years at MGM, had left MGM to go to work in a picture at Warner Brothers. And at the same time, a survey of the exhibitors of the United States had named her box office poison. So she started working in this film then when we started handling her. And Henry and I together wrote an item. And this is in effect what the item said. It said, after the first 2 weeks of shooting of Mildred Pierce, the front office of Warner Brothers is jumping with glee over the rushes that they're seeing of Joan Crawford, and they are saying she'll be nominated for an Oscar. That was the item. I planted it with Hedda Hopper, who ran it word for word. And when I saw it, I went into Henry's office and I said, Henry, let us just repeat this over and over again, and let's direct our attention to the then 2,000 or 2,500 members of the Academy. I said, let's forget the public right now as such. So we did a campaign really directed toward those 2,500 members. And in that campaign was one ad in the trades, calling attention to Joan Crawford and her performance coming up in Mildred Pierce. And that was the beginning of the For Your Consideration ads that you see to this day in the trades. And it worked, and Joan Crawford did indeed win the Academy Award. Whereupon we were hired by Jane Wyman the next year for her, and she won for her performance in Johnny Belinda. Same thing.
Just a postscript. Did you ever see those first 2 reels that you wrote about?
No.
Strictly publicity.
Strictly publicity.
Let's talk about the studio system in those days, dealing with, in terms of publicity. What studios did you work with?
Well, it's interesting. You asked if I saw the first 2 reels of the Mildred Pierce. Not only did I not see it, but we were not permitted on the lot. We were not allowed to go on the lot because we were, quote, independent publicists, and the studios did not approve of independent publicists. And what happened to change that was Joan Crawford, while she was shooting the movie, called Jack Warner from the set one morning, and she said, I'm going to be out for 2 hours for lunch today, so you better be prepared that the shooting will be a little slow. And of course he said, why? And she said, well, my publicist is not allowed on this lot, so I'm going to Beverly Hills to meet him for lunch, and it'll take me 2 hours by the time I get back. And all of a sudden, we were permitted on the Warner Brothers lot.
How much control did the studios have over the entertainment media?
Well, I'm not sure about entertainment community, but the, quote, studios had tremendous control, as you read and heard. And they decided that people could not announce that they had become married because that would be bad for their image and for the box office. They decided who could go out with whom and when. It was a very, very tightly controlled system.
Near the end of the 40s, you become a partner, and it becomes the famous Rogers and Cowan. What precipitated the change?
I think it was about 1951, if I'm not mistaken, but Henry and I used to go out to dinner once a week with the client list, and we would not be interrupted, and we would discuss the clients, and this became a weekly formula for both of us. And on one such night, I remember Henry drove me back to my car. Our offices were then on La Cienega Boulevard. And instead of letting me off at my car, he pulled up ahead and he got out with me and walked me back to my car. And I remember his asking if I had my own attorney. And I said, no, I don't have an attorney. If I ever needed legal help, I'd ask whoever the man was who represented his company. And Henry said, Warren, I think you should get your own lawyer, because I forgot to tell you, we changed the name of the company today to Rogers and Cowan. You are now my full partner. You and I are going to have to sign a lot of papers. You should get a lawyer to protect you. Good night. And that's how it became Rogers and Cowan.
Were you excited?
I very much was, yeah. I had such admiration for Henry Rogers, who was a very special and brilliant and wise man.
Did your responsibilities change as a full partner?
Not really.
Still worked hard. At the 50s saw the end of the studio system. So how did that change affect your business?
Well, it affected us to a great degree. We were suddenly handling films, and a lot of the clients that had worked under the studio system were now free to do as they wanted, such as Alan Ladd, I remember, who had been under contract to Paramount, all of a sudden was free to make pictures where he wanted and under different guises, and sometimes under his own production banner. And then we would handle the pictures as well as Alan Ladd. And there were many others.
There was also something else that was happening, and that was the celebrity charity fundraiser. Up until this time, it wasn't. How did that come about?
You've done your homework, haven't you? As happens many times, I think it was by accident. One of the clients of Henry Rogers was a lovely director named Frank Borzage. Frank Borzage had won 2 Academy Awards. He had directed Wings and 1 or 2 others. And he was a very prominent director of the time. And he was talking about making one movie. And I remember saying to Henry Rogers, we've been talking about this one film of Frank Borzage's for 6 months, and I don't know what else to say about it. And then I said, tell me, what does he do all day long? And Henry said he plays golf every day. And from that conversation, we put together the Frank Borzage Invitational Golf Tournament, a one-day tournament here in Culver City at Fox Hills, To my absolute amazement, I learned that you can get publicity quicker in the sports sections than any other section in the paper, in my opinion. And second, what I learned was how many jocks there are in Hollywood, because the stars that came out to play in this one-day tournament would blow you away. There was Fred Astaire and Clark Gable and Mickey Rooney and Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, and they all came for this one-day tournament. And the second year of it, we got Marilyn Monroe, who was then a starlet, to be the, quote, official scorekeeper, and arranged for Frank Sinatra to land in a helicopter on the first tee and caddy for Bing Crosby, which he did for a hole or two. And out of that little Frank Borzage charity, it was a charity tournament, out of that came the Bing Crosby tournament. Bing played in the Borzage, and Bing started his own golf tournament in Pebble Beach, which still exists. It's now under the name of the AT&T tournament. But many big stars played in the Crosby every year. I remember that Dean Martin used to have it in his contract that if he was shooting a movie on that weekend of the Bing Crosby tournament, he had to have time off to go to Pebble Beach. And from Crosby came all other kinds of celebrity tournaments. We had Clint Eastwood ski tournament, and there are tennis tournaments. I remember putting together a Lucille Ball backgammon tournament.
At this moment, in looking back, do you smile that what you started has beget a whole new way?
Well, yes and no. I try not to look back. I'm looking to tomorrow and to today. For example, Reba, people frequently ask me who my favorite client is. And my answer is the next one. And I stay with that.
Now let's get to television, because, this is for the Television Academy. Your firm represented television programs. What were your jobs, and what were some of the shows that you represented?
Well, let me go back.
Okay.
In the early 1950s, we had, I think, the biggest, or one of the biggest, Hollywood publicity firms, representing all kinds of movie stars and singers and band leaders like Harry James, and movies, and some people on radio, Lucille Ball and Jack Benny and people like that. But in the 50s, I had an amazing experience, which I'll share with you because it affected our careers. There was a marvelous publicist named Mac Millar. I'm sure you haven't heard of him. But in the early 50s, he was older than Henry and I, but we were talking to Mac about possibly forming an association. He had 4 or 5 clients, and I have to explain who they were, and then you'll understand the reason I'm telling you this story. He had William Wyler, whose fee was $5,000 a year. He had Tony Martin, he represented, whose fee was $5,000 a year. I believe he had Frank Sinatra, who either paid $7,500 or $10,000 a year. And he had Bob Hope, with whom he had started, who, between Bob Hope personally and his movies and his personal appearances, paid Mac $150,000 a year. You have the picture. And this was many years ago. Well, I had occasion, I want to preface this by saying I've always known Bob Hope to be one of the gentlest and loveliest and nicest men I've ever known. But I had occasion to walk into Mac Millar's hotel suite in New York while we were talking about this possible merger. And he was just finishing a very unpleasant conversation with Bob Hope. Now, Mac had been in New York opening a New Hope picture, which I'll never forget. It was called Hope, Faith, Hope, and Charity. And Bob found two girls, well endowed, one of whom had a sign across the front that said Miss Faith, and the other one had Miss Charity. And he would send them into newsrooms and into television newsrooms. And invariably, the editors and the writers would say, well, where is Miss Hope? And then it explained that he's in California and he has a new movie opening and would be plugging Faith, Hope, and Charity. I thought that was rather clever and brilliant. At any rate, walking into his room, and he's following some kind of a difficult conversation, I'm afraid, with Bob Hope. When he hung up, he was shaking and he was white, and God, I was afraid he was going to have a heart attack right in front of me. And having told you that story, I went back to California, went into Henry Rogers' office, and told him the story I just told you. I said, Henry, I don't want us ever to have one client that pays that much more than all the others, and I think we have to start diversifying, because David Susskind once said, you have to keep running, otherwise the competition will catch up with you. So I said we should diversify, and we agreed that television was the obvious target for us, because there was a whole interesting thing happening in the 50s in television. Most of the shows had a single sponsor, not like today with multiple sponsors. So there was the Bell Telephone Hour and the Philco Playhouse and the Colgate Comedy Series, and they were all one sponsor. What we learned is that the big advertisers allowed their advertising agency to develop their own programming. So we went after the advertising agencies. We went in, and it was agreed that I would kind of run Rogers and Cowan in Hollywood. Henry would spend more time in New York, and I would come in when there was a big presentation. As a consequence, through meetings with people at Compton Agency and Benton and Bowles and some of the others, we opened up Procter & Gamble. We went to Cincinnati and made a big presentation to P&G, which had many shows that they hired us to handle. Make Room for Daddy and the Dick Van Dyke Show and a half a dozen others. Andy Griffith's show. We handled Wyatt Earp. And we wound up handling not only Procter & Gamble shows, but most of the shows of General Foods as well. And we got them all through the advertising agencies who selected the shows, who actually produced them, and then sold them to the networks.
We're going to stop. They're going to change the tape, and then we'll take and talk about some of these shows individually, if that's okay with you.